to be here so far. This should do something. Oh, it's doing too much. Okay, right. So recently, and especially since the pandemic, I've been finding myself in the uncomfortable situation of having to try to answer some really awkward questions. Such as, how do you know that the government is not paying scientists to tell us that vaccines are safe? Are you absolutely sure that all these COVID deaths we read about in the papers are not made up by the journalists? How can you be certain there is no chance that climate change has been invented by a powerful group of left-wing individuals? And so on and so forth. Now, all of these questions presuppose a certain form of skepticism, and they're also intended to elicit in the other person, me in this case, the same idea. And skepticism in its more radical form is the idea that we can never really know anything. Everything is open to doubt. So if everything is open to doubt, then anything is possible. But if we stick to this idea, then we're stuck. We cannot know anything, we cannot do anything, and there are philosophical problems with this. Because if you really think that everything is open to doubt, then even the idea that everything is open to doubt is open to doubt. But more relevantly, practically, it's impossible to live by this idea. Even René Descartes, the philosopher who famously practiced radical doubt, said, do it in your study, don't do it outside in the street. Don't go outside and doubt the existence of external objects in the streets, because that's not a good idea. So we cannot live by that. And yet, there seems to be some truth to the skeptical argument. If we agree to the idea of knowledge that they're trying to ask, it seems to be true that I cannot definitely prove that the government is not paying scientists to tell us vaccines are safe. I cannot definitely prove that COVID deaths are not made up by journalists, and I cannot give them the proof they need that climate change has not been invented by a powerful left-wing group. But the kind of knowledge that these skeptics want is a negative kind of knowledge. They want to know that something is not the case. And that is not a knowledge that is reasonable for anyone to expect. For various reasons. One is that you cannot prove a negative. I can tell you that a gold mountain does not exist, but I can only prove that all of the scientific, geological, and geographical evidence that we have has not found any trace of a golden mountain. That's all I can do. The best scientific knowledge has exactly this method. We can tell you that the MMR vaccines do not cause autism, but that means that all the evidence that has been gathered so far has not found a cause between that vaccine and autism. That is the best thing that science can do, tell you that you have not found evidence to prove this. But there is a third reason, which is a little bit more disconcerting, why I cannot give the skeptic the answer that they want. And that is that I do not have all of that knowledge firsthand, and I cannot have all of the relevant knowledge firsthand. And that's because my sources of knowledge are not infinite. The research that I can do is limited. And therefore, when I say that I know that the COVID deaths are not made up, it means that I am relying on trust. And when I do that, when I rely on trust, it means that I accept that I cannot prove everything by myself. I accept that I'm relying on somebody else, and that therefore I am dependent and vulnerable on somebody. As philosopher Annette Beyer famously put it in an influential paper, trust is accepted vulnerability. That means not only that when we trust we're vulnerable, but that we accept the weakness that comes with trust. But here we begin to see why skepticism and distrust seems a little bit appealing, right? Because it seems to go against one of the pillars of contemporary Western society, which is autonomy. The idea that we should be independent. We shouldn't take anything from other people. We should find everything for ourselves and be able to prove everything for ourselves and not depend on anyone else. Now, this comes from a very useful and good idea ever since the Enlightenment, when Immanuel Kant reacted against superstition by saying you have to have the courage to use your own reason, sapere aude. But this idea has been overly simplified and therefore misconstrued. But yet it seems that there is some tension between the importance of autonomy and trust. And therefore, distrust makes us stronger, makes us more autonomous. And that's why it seems to be appealing. Now, I want to talk about distrust in experts, public distrust in scientific experts. And I want to take two examples which at first sight seem quite different, but I think they lead us to a similar conclusion and something that we can learn from distrust. And I'll be drawing on a recent paper that I co-authored with Maria Bagramian, who is the leader of the Peritia project. The first example is the case of vaccine hesitancy amongst Black people in the United States, where it has been shown that African Americans have been disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. More deaths, more disease. And at the same time, the same people were less likely to get vaccinated. So, big problem. More impact, less vaccination. Why is that? Was it a failure of knowledge? Were these people just not informed enough? I think that's not the case. The reason why the people were more impacted and at the same time more distrustful was that they have been repeatedly failed by the American medical system. Why would they think that? Well, we don't need to look very far. We can look, for example, one of the starkest and darkest example of the reasons for this distrust, the Tuskegee experiments, where a group of impoverished Black Americans were used as subjects for a study on syphilis. The study went on for 40 years, not that long ago. The people were not told what the experiments were about. They were not told how long the study would go on for, and they were not given the cure for syphilis even after the cure was widely available. This was funded by whom? Well, by the US Public Health Service. So there is a reasonable distrust, which is based on past events. And we can say, okay, well, it's all in the past. Unfortunately not. There is evidence that infant mortality amongst Black people is double when the children are treated by a white physician than were treated by a Black physician. So the distrust has current roots as well. And yet it's harmful to the very people who find it reasonable to distrust. End of the first example. We'll come back to it. Second example, climate change denial. And here I want to talk about the cool dudes. So it has been found by a study by McWright and Dunlop that climate change denial was mostly prevalent among conservative white males in the States, much more than in any other group. Why would that be the case? Well, what do these people have in common? Conservative, they want things not to change. White, male, privilege and power. So these two cases, these two examples of vaccine hesitancy and climate change denial have this one characteristic in common. Power, or rather, the lack or the loss of it. So if we believe Bayer that trust is accepted vulnerability, then skepticism rejects trust because what it wants to reject is vulnerability. And in both cases, there is a real threat by making oneself vulnerable, by opening oneself up to trust. In the first case, the people who rejected the vaccine, the Black Americans who rejected the vaccines, had a lot to lose, either by trusting and by distrusting. In the second case, the people who don't believe climate science feel that they're safe in their distrust, because after all, they are the ones who are least impacted by climate change right now. So they are in a position of current power. But in both cases, this power is being eroded by the possibility of trust. In the case of vaccine hesitancy, there is already a lack of power, so there is a reason for not wanting this power to be eroded even further by trusting people who have shown not to be worthy of that trust. In the case of conservative white males, there is traditionally too much power, And therefore, the fear of losing that power by taking seriously climate change, which would mean taking actions that change their positions in society, change their lifestyles from what it has been so far. And so, on one hand, actual vulnerability, and on the other hand, the fear of becoming vulnerable, makes these groups resistant to trust, even though trust would be in their interests. So what do we learn from this? Is public distrust just an evil? Well, I don't think so. What we learn is, first of all, that distrust about scientific matters is not just about facts and knowledge, and it doesn't take us all the way to just keep giving evidence and evidence. And trust has consequences, and it is the consequences of trust that creates mistrust, not just the information, the kinds of actions that we would have to take if we trusted doctors, if we trusted climate change experts, that creates problems. And finally, that accepting vulnerability can require strength, strength that oppressed groups don't feel they have, and that privileged groups do not want to muster, because that would erode their privilege. So, what do we do? How do we take distrust to be of value? Well, in the first case of acts in hesitancy, the value of distrust is that it signals injustice. We need to take this distrust very seriously and understand that it is based on very real inequality and do something about that, as opposed to the information. In the second case, surprisingly similarly, we can also use this distrust to address, again, not information. A lot of those people are educated enough, but to address this fear and this sense of group belonging that they fear is under threat. And finally, which is my final point, we can actually find forms of trust that do not have to negate autonomy. So for earlier, I put trust and autonomy on opposite ends of the scale, as if we trust, we lose our autonomy. Well, I think that's based on a misunderstanding of what autonomy actually is. Can we have the courage to use our own reason and trust? I think we do. Distrust can be an exercise of autonomy, but sometimes it is so for bad reasons. And one of the bad reasons is to think that autonomy can be absolute, that we can get all the information we need by ourselves, that we can get by without relying on anybody else. So, if we want to be autonomous, we don't have to be a skeptic. We can be a skeptic only if we think that atomic individualism is true, that the sense of individuality, which is radical and absolute, is true. But that is impossible. So how do we recover autonomy and trust? How do we dare to know, as Kant said, and at the same time trust experts? Well, we can use our own reason to choose whom to trust. We can use our own reason to understand that not all sources are equally as good. We can use our reason to know when to doubt, when we have good reasons to doubt, and why to doubt. Because, after all, skepticism does have a role in our lives, but only in its limited form. We do need reasons to trust, but we also need reasons to doubt. And the idea that anything is possible is not one of them. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Do you want to keep standing or do you want to sit down?
I can sit down.
Yeah. So I was wondering, and you can prepare your questions. We're going to get to them in a minute. The more you do your research, the more you dig into the whole topic of trust and distrust, the more skeptical you get by yourself, or the more optimistic and trustful?
Well, if we talk about public trust and the optimism that public trust will grow, I think there is optimism the more we do research and then find out the causes of public distrust, and then we can do something about it. So I do feel more hopeful, and I feel less and less skeptical when I compare evidence and I realize that even though that kind of absolute certainty is impossible, we do not have to think that everything is equal, all sources are the same, which is one of the main arguments of conspiracy theories and people who try to erode trust and say, well, we have to listen to all sources. We can, but they're not all equally credible, they're not all equally trustworthy, and they are not all equally based on the same evidence. So not all sources matter in the same way. And once we get more tools to try to differentiate and to understand not only why we have good rational reasons to trust some sources and not others, but also what are the non-rational reasons, such as fear, such as the fear of losing power, the fear of being even more vulnerable, then I think we have a more comprehensive image of what it is that creates difficulties. And we could, in principle, act on it without being patronizing, which is sometimes the case when you just say, well, this is what is true, this is the evidence, if you're not rational enough. And that doesn't seem to be a good strategy.
I have so many more questions, but probably so do you. Maybe some of you already know the very unique microphone we're going to use in that room. Maybe we can have some light on it. It's going to be thrown right at you once you dare to ask a question. And now is the opportunity to do so. So please raise your hands. Maybe one hand. Cool. We start over there. Please catch it and please throw it nicely.
Please speak directly into the black box so that we can hear you.
So, thank you very much. My name is Henrik, and you just briefly mentioned the word to know. So, what is your understanding of knowledge in this context? Are you referring to Plato's understanding that knowledge is justified true belief, or is it something else?
Yeah, great question. I don't have any specific concept of knowledge, which is true knowledge. What I was trying to do is to counter a specific idea of knowledge, which is that we need to be able to prove everything, including negatives, by ourselves, and saying that this is not a knowledge that is impossible to acquire. Now, once we put that to aside, there are different ways of knowing, and once trust is in place, of course, that means that we have a different kind of knowledge. If, say, I read a report on climate change without having any first-hand experience of how the research is done, I can say that I know because I trust these people, but it's a very different sort of knowledge than the one that I would have if I were one of the members who created that knowledge. But I don't think that the former should not be called knowledge, because otherwise a lot of the things that we claim to know would have to go out of the window.
There was another hand, even more in the back. Yeah, last row. Nice exercise in the morning.
Hi, my name is Carlos, and you thought about basically very rational ways of understanding and being skeptic. But what we see nowadays concerning the ideas that you presented and the groups you presented, we saw very strong phenomena concerning not rational reactions, but emotional reactions based on trust in groups. For instance, WhatsApp, close groups or friend groups that influenced elections in some cases, or are very definite elements to impact this very practical and very concrete parts of everybody's life. So how do you propose to put this in the equation? Not rational ways of understanding the world, and not concerning basically social media and this kind of group tribal relations. How do you consider it?
Thank you. Yes, I agree with you. The problem of distrust in science is not just a question of reason and information, and that's very much the point that I was trying to make. So on the one hand, we have this philosophical idea of skepticism, which is misused by some groups to try to create doubt where they themselves do not fully adhere to skepticism. I mean, if you think of conspiracy theories, they start with leading questions of how do you know that the government is not behind all of this? But they don't think that anything is possible. What they think is that there is a clear reason that the government is behind it and that they're trying to control us, or whatever it is that they think. So you can use reason to show them that even their own arguments are, in fact, just ways of trying to mislead and to disinform, but they're not real arguments. And then, once you've put skepticism, real philosophical skepticism to one side and show them that that's not actually what they're doing, you address the non-philosophical, non-rational part of the equation, which is it driven by fear? Is it driven by group identity? And therefore, we're no longer just talking about the information. We're talking about why is it that you don't like the consequences of the information? So if we talk about climate change, is it the case that these people don't really believe that what the scientists are saying, or that they don't want to act in such a way as they would have to act if they believe the consequences? And therefore, they talk about the fact that the information is incorrect, whereas what they don't want to accept is the consequences of the information. And these are two different things, and we need to be able to disentangle them. Because distrust groups often like to confuse the levels. They talk about false information, whereas actually they don't like the policies that follow from information. They talk about bad science, where actually they don't like the change in lifestyles that they would have to do if the information was correct. So we need to be able to show that these are two different levels of discourse. And if you don't like the consequences, then we need to talk about politics and about lifestyle. But that doesn't mean that the facts are wrong. So I agree, we need to be able to talk about all these different levels, and not all of them are addressed by rationality. Thank you.
You will see it's pretty ambitious what we're planning to do here, and everyone just gets like roughly 20 minutes. So it's already my last question, but you'll be around, so later you can ask her anything if you want to know more. My last question maybe also has a personal takeaway in these times of fake news and conspiracy theories. How are you dealing with, like, enduring the ambivalence and complexity of things? What's your recommendation for everyone in this room?
Oh.
Just a simple question for the happy end of the session.
Yes, one minute.
Yeah.
Don't spend a lot of time on social media. And find trustworthy sources, which means not the ones that you like, but the ones that have, that there is research out there about what are the markers of trust. And when we talk about scientists, there are clear markers of trust, such as where did they study, did they get a degree, where did they publish, was that experiment replicated by others, was that experiment supported by other scientists, what the kind of consensus among the scientific community, what kind of funding they received. Look at those markers and see whether they apply.
Thank you so much. Be a very mistrusting person.
Thank you.
Silvia Caprioglio Panizza, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.